Hi everyone. So today we are going to look at this particular position. In studying Endgame, we definitely need to look at positions where there's pawn and king, rook and king, maybe knight and king, bishop and king, and pawns. The different scenarios will come up. I think with 7 pieces on the board, the game is pretty much solved. But I think it's impossible to memorize all of them. So we need to study what exactly our goals should be at an endgame position, what I should look at. So right now, let me just highlight what I usually think about and what do I exactly lack, right? First of all, I haven't studied endgames in too much depth. The only time I've faced endgames is practically in a game or either online or on the board, and I never had the chance to take a pause, set up a position, and see what I should have done, or internalize a couple of things about the endgames that okay, this is what I should have done and why. This is something that I should have known from the get-go. So today we are going to take a look at this particular position to to slowly understand and build our understanding on these are the typical things that you should look at, and from there it will be much more easier for us to play the end games. So this is a very common end game, I'll say, much more reachable. Usually you'll see a couple of less pawns as well, maybe 2 or 3 pawns. The most likely I've seen 3 pawns on one side, maybe 1 or 2 pawns on the other side of the board, and nothing in between. Maybe either g7 or e pawn will be not available, and 1 pawn on e4. Such types of positions are quite common with one rook and multiple pawns on the board. A lot of exchanges can happen, like this particular scenario looks like a queen's gambit declined, yeah, where maybe bishop on so knight on f3 was captured by the bishop and captured by the pawn. So this is something which is quite reachable. Now in this scenario, it's white to move, and usually these positions you reach when you have 1 or 2 minutes on the clock, right? Or if it's played, it's 5 or 10 seconds or 30 seconds. Let's assume best case scenario. So in such short amount of time, if you have a slightly bad structure like this one, then as a while playing white, I would think of the first move that most naturally comes to mind is rook c1, exchanging the rooks and then continue playing because the pawns are equal, right? uh, 2 on one side and 4 on the other. So the first thing that comes to mind is rook c1 and exchanging the rooks. Of course that puts our king slightly behind on the board, whereas black's king is active. So that is very first. Second thing, we could think of maybe pushing these pawns and trying to stick with them, but we know that black's rook is quite active and he could go either side and start redirecting these two weak pawns if our king moves away. Of course, since our rook is behind, he'll have to go to a more active file. Black's king can enter and stops white's rook from entering any of these squares to actually try and attack these pawns or these pawns. So yeah, we know black's rook is active, so most natural thing or most basic instinct usually I would come up with is to exchange the rooks and then go play this, because this would be somewhat holdable since the number of pawns is same. Here, let's say if I'm playing from black side, right, I think I would start pushing pawns. Most naturally I would push f5 and that will give, yeah, spike. Pretty much equalize the position, I think. Played inconsistently or a couple of bad moves, and yeah, I'll white will equalize in this particular scenario. Now, why would I push pawns in this situation? First is we can go this way and block these pawns from coming up, and I would think, okay, since I have a better structure of pawns, no double pawns, I should be able to penetrate and get my pawn to the last rank, or at least hold white's king to defend a particular pawn, maybe one of these pawns with the one of black pawn, and I'll maneuver here, gobble up this, and try to queen this side as well. So my first instinct would be to push these pawns, okay, straight up. But in this particular scenario, while studying this position, I understood one thing. You actually don't need to push these pawns. Simple idea is, since there are only kings present on the board, black king can actually just come up. His pawns are not going to die to white king. He'll have to march his way to capture any of the black pawns. So uh, black king can actually come up the board. That's first. Second, uh, if I want to approach, where should I approach? Playing from black side. So these two pawns are defended, as are these three. So the only weakness in white's camp is this pawn on h2. But to be honest, I myself would not have considered marching this way up to h1 pawn. I would be afraid what happens if this king comes up and gobbles of one of these pawns. In a short period of time, when you have 1 or 2 minutes left and you have not studied such situations or scenarios, I would have just start pushing the pawns because of these two ideas, that okay, if I try to reach, then uh, white will try to queen and maybe will simultaneously queen. But now that I think about it, now that I've gone through this particular scenario, the second thing that comes is, if white king, instead of defending this pawn, goes up here, tries to gobble up any of the pawns on the black scam, he'll have to take a much longer route. As you can imagine, uh, if uh, white comes in, he can't approach any of these two squares. So first of all, there will be tempis lost here, and then even if you try to capture one of these pawns, I can simply push up, and approaching this pawn, then this pawn will be lengthy. Also, not to forget, white king will have to capture both of these pawns. If he tries to push up, I can exchange and I'll gain one more tempi. So in short, white king cannot just directly go and capture these pawns. It will take much more time if than black king to approach and gobble up these pawns. So this is, I think, one of the key points we should remember when we are analyzing this position, such positions. Of course, after going through maybe hundreds or more thousands of games through end games, I'll be able to understand, okay, yeah, this is how I should quickly calculate this. So if there are two pawns together, he will have to lose a lot of tempis. Meanwhile, can I approach? So in this particular situation, while playing from white, this is Rubinstein's game. Okay, white played rook c1, capture happened, and then uh, game continued. I think game ended in draw, but white is black is clearly winning. So why is that? Instead of pushing these pawns, which I would have done, black starts marching the king. Now once this happens, even if I would have started marching the king, I think I would have gone for this pawn or this pawn, not directly for this pawn. It seems quite counterintuitive, but that is how we should approach it. This is a weak pawn. White cannot capture any of my pawns, at least not yet. And by the time White King tries approaching any of these pawns, I can just quickly march my pawn up and have a decisive advantage. I can queen my pawn very very quick. So let's say what happens if king d3. If you play king d3, white can never reach this pawn. That's just visibly available. We don't need to calculate that as well. So his idea is to go this route, but we have already established that that is not possible. Let's take a look at this once. And I think b5 is also good. Yeah, he'll have to lose 1 2 tempest to capture, or 1 2 3 4 tempest just to capture, and I in that many moves I'll be able to queen. So this is obviously losing. So what happens if white king comes to rescue this and this pawn? So now white is playing with 2 pawns, sorry, 4 pawns against 6 pawns. Okay. Now because our king is so active, we have essentially blocked white king and stuck him with these 2 pawns, defending these 2 pawns. What should be our next move? I think stopping these 2 pawns is the most essential part. Why? Given time, if these pawns match up, these 3 pawns gets exchanged, then white can, since this is h pawn, white can stay here in the on the f file, and we have seen what happens when you have a pawn on the h file or the corner files, and white king basically blocks these 3 essential squares and black king is stuck. Yeah. So in this particular situation, uh, we should stop marching of these 2 pawns ahead, and I think e5 does this pretty well. If pawn e4 happens, white can never push this pawn. Of course I'll capture, and this pawn is not going to queen because of this pawn, and once I push this, these 2 squares are blocked and my king is free to go around any place. So this is also bad because once captured, this structure you're never going to win. This is also quite visibly clear, and then we can push our pawns. So e5 is the move to stop these 2 pawns from going ahead. King has to go h1. There these 2 moves are not legal, and moving these pawns is pretty much useless, so king h1, and then we can go b5. I've seen these moves a lot in Grandmaster Kings, so this is also same idea. You cannot push these pawns, and these 4 pawns are basically stuck. They are not going to move. So with king stuck, we can push our pawns ahead. Of course not e4. We should be trying for this. So this is the actual structure we'll be leaving with, and from this point onwards I think it's pretty much straightforward. We push our pawns, exchange, and with the white king stuck behind, once we have exchange everything. So let's just go through it quickly. Okay, so even here we need to be careful what we do. Okay, so here I think this is the move to stop white king from ever approaching, and from here if pushed, yeah, we can take, and that's it. One pass pawn, white will have to stay here and guard this pawn. and we can march this way and gobble up the pawns. Of course, we'll first play e6 and make sure that uh, this pawn or this pawn reaches the end of the file very very quickly. What's next? So this is still not possible, simply I'll queen. So then I can go this way. Yeah, so basically the idea is get your king active, approach the opponent's weakness, and once they march ahead, block block the progression of other pawns, try to block it. So this is the idea. So based on the analysis of this particular scenario, I thought of a couple of things. So let's take a look at that. I've pointed out a few things. So what should be our checklist in a end game like this, which gave me insight into how I should look at the end games. The first thing was who has more active king or active pieces. That is the first thing. Once I exchange queens, I'll be looking forward to what who has more active pieces essentially, or and active kings. So in this case, both kings are quite active. uh, if rook was on an open file, black's king would be able to stop it. Both are on second files from the original position, so I'll say yeah, both kings are equally active. Second thing, what are my opponent's weaknesses and my weaknesses? If I'm playing white, most obvious thing is I have this particular weakness on my board, and this pawn, these two pawns I'll say are quite weak. Of course I can defend this one, but this is a very big weakness on my camp if I'm playing from white. Right now I can't actually point out any weakness for black's camp. Who has more pawn islands? This I think is part of the weaknesses portion only. White clearly has 3 pawn islands, whereas black has 2. In this, the most common thing, if you might have heard in commentaries out there, uh, pawn, the number of pawn islands creates number of weaknesses. You create multiple weaknesses and try to attack all of them. Here, since I have 3, I know I'm slightly worse playing as white, and if rook reaches here, this will be vulnerable. My rook will be tied to the protection of the pawn, and this active rook could anytime come to this way. Now let's see whose pawn structure is better and why. Of course, double pawns is bad and this structure is better. I think there will be scenarios where even if you have correct pawn structure in sequence wise, like one pawn on each file, your structure might be worse. So we'll see going ahead when we see a couple of more scenarios or positions. Maybe we'll come up with some pawn structures. Next is from this what I have internalized, what I need to keep in mind, just like breathing. If there are only kings on the board, you can leave your pawns to go and capture opponent's pawns. It's a question and an exclamation mark. Yeah, based on this, basically, I realized that yeah, my king is free to roam. Opponent's king is not going to come in and capture my pawns. If these two kings were on center, I'll say it's quite different. Then I am not going to go and capture this pawn because white's king is equally active. By the time I reach here, yeah, white is going to gobble up these pawns. So in that particular scenario, I'm not going to go and gobble up pawns. But if there is a possibility my king is much more active, I'll try to look for scenarios where my king can just march up the board and capture something. If there is only one rook on board, king can sometimes stop opponent's rooks from entering your position. So yeah, like this, I realized this very late, but I'll say in this scenario, even though black uh, has active rook, he cannot enter any of these squares, right? Uh, King is defending all these critical squares. This is also not reachable. These four squares are also not reachable. The only weakness is this. So if the appropriate move here would have been f4 for white to cut off the rook from reaching to this pawn. Of course, there are moves like e6 or e5 or g5, which can on the surface look good, but g5 basically will have same structure, so you'll have also a weakness. And if you play e5, then I would be able to defend my pawn, so that's just straight up bad. You're losing a pawn. In this scenario, of course, white would be under pressure as black rook is strong. Black can still march his king up. You cannot just leave here, otherwise rook will enter and pressurize this pawn as well later on if the rook moves. But I think this is of course defendable. Of course, computer says it's defendable. So rook h1. I'm locking this pawn. I think g3 would be much better. I'm not going to let king enter the position, so comes from here. Rook g1 and rook g3. Of course, this rook is never going to enter the files because we are covering these three. He'll have to go give a check, but then again, this is much more defendable. There's no point in pushing this. Of course, this is a break black can try for, but even though difficult, this might be holdable. Once these pawns are exchanged, we can go here, try to attack this pawn, and if this moves, this one falls. So we'll have some counter attack, and this might be holdable. But going rook c3 just, yeah, is bad. That's all for today.